I don't really know how to start this, but I guess I'll just tell it like it happened. A few years back, me and some friends thought we could start a website about paranormal investigations. You know the type, people writing about creepy, haunted places, trying to get attention online. We weren't professionals or anything, just a group of friends who were into that kind of stuff. Most of the time, we'd write up stories about old houses or cemeteries, places with some spooky history, but nothing too serious. It was mostly just fun for us. But then someone suggested we check out Willowbrook Asylum. The place had been abandoned for decades. Everyone in the area knew it was supposed to be haunted, but nobody ever went there. It was hidden deep in the woods, way off the beaten path. You had to drive down a dirt road for miles before the building came into view, overgrown with ivy and half collapsed in places. There were rumors about what went on inside before it shut down, but the creepiest one was that the spirits of the patients still roamed the halls, angry and vengeful. I'm not gonna lie, I wasn't all that excited about going, but Mark, the guy who was really pushing this website idea, was obsessed. He had read old articles about how it had been shut down after a fire broke out and several patients were never found. Supposedly, their bodies were never recovered, and it was believed they had been trapped in the basement when the building collapsed. Mark figured if we could get any evidence or even write a detailed blog post from inside, it would blow up the site. The others agreed. I didn't want to be the only one backing out, so I went along. We showed up late one evening, just before the sun started to set. The road leading to the asylum was barely a road at all, just mud and overgrown weeds. The place was huge, looming over us as we got closer. Its windows were mostly shattered, and the walls were cracked and covered in graffiti. The air smelled damp, like rot. It felt wrong even standing near it. I heard the locals say you're not supposed to go in after dark, said Kelly, one of the girls in our group. She was half joking, but I could tell she was spooked. Mark laughed and said, that's exactly when we should go in. If there's any paranormal activity, we're more likely to catch it at night. We geared up, flashlights, some old recorders, and cameras to document what we could. Mark had this whole setup planned. We'd split into two groups and explore different parts of the building. The main goal was to reach the basement. According to the legends, that was where the worst of the hauntings occurred. Most of us thought it was just a load of crap, but Mark was dead set on finding something. The entrance was wide open, the door hanging off its hinges. Stepping inside was like walking into a time capsule. The air was stale, thick with dust, and everything looked like it had been frozen in time since the asylum closed. Old medical equipment lay scattered across the floor, rusted and decayed. The walls were peeling, and in some places it looked like someone or something had clawed at them. I didn't want to touch anything. We split up as planned. Mark, Kelly, and I went toward the upper floors, while the other group, Jake and Sarah, headed for the basement. Our goal was to meet back at the entrance in an hour. At first, nothing happened. We wandered through the halls, calling out to any spirits that might be hanging around, cracking jokes to lighten the mood. The building creaked with every step we took, but aside from the occasional rat scurrying by, it was just an old, creepy place. It wasn't until we reached the second floor that things started to feel off. I can't really explain it. One minute, everything felt normal, and the next, it was like the temperature dropped by 10 degrees. The air became heavy, and there was this pressure, like something was watching us. I glanced over at Kelly, and I could tell she felt it too. "Did you hear that?" Mark asked, stopping suddenly. I hadn't heard anything at first, but then, faintly, I picked up on it. A sort of whispering, like someone talking just out of earshot. It was so low, I couldn't make out the words, but it was definitely there. The whispering seemed to grow louder, but no matter where we looked, we couldn't see anyone. It sounded like it was coming from the walls. Kelly grabbed my arm. "I don't like this," she said, her voice shaking. Mark, being Mark, insisted we press on. He thought it was exactly the kind of thing we were looking for. But as we continued down the hallway, the whispering got louder, and then, out of nowhere, it stopped. That's when the door at the end of the hall slammed shut. We all jumped when the door slammed. Mark saying it was probably just the wind, but there was no breeze. The air inside the asylum was thick, stale. No way the wind could have done that. Kelly's hand was still gripping my arm. "We should go," she muttered. Mark, of course, was having none of it. "Come on, it's just a door. We're here to investigate, remember?" Reluctantly, we moved toward the door. The closer we got, the colder it seemed to get. By the time we reached it, my breath was visible in the air. Mark reached for the handle and paused for just a second before pulling it open. Behind the door was a staircase leading upward, the steps disappearing into darkness. "I thought we were going to the basement," I said, trying to mask the unease in my voice. "We are," Mark replied, but we might as well check out the attic while we're up here. I bet no one's been up there in years. I didn't like the idea, but again, I didn't want to be the one to back out. We climbed the stairs. The higher we went, the more I started to notice a strange smell, something rotten like meat that had been left out for too long. When we reached the top, there was a single door, old and weathered. Mark pushed it open, and the smell hit us like a wave. I gagged and had to cover my mouth. The room was large, bigger than I expected, with a slanted ceiling and a single window on the far side, boarded up. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, and in the far corner was what looked like a pile of old rags. But then the rags moved. At first I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but then they moved again. Kelly gasped, taking a step back, and Mark, as usual, went right for it. He shined his flashlight on the pile, and that's when we saw it. A hand. A pale skeletal hand poking out from underneath the rags, the skin hanging loosely off the bone. Mark froze. We all did. For what felt like an eternity, we just stood there staring. And then the hand twitched. Before any of us could react, the door behind us slammed shut. This time, it wasn't the wind. The sound echoed through the room, and that's when the pile of rags started to rise. Slowly, so slowly, whatever was beneath them began to stand up. It wasn't until it fully stood that I realized it was a person, or at least it used to be. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its skin was stretched tight across its bones. It didn't make a sound, just stood there, staring at us. I've never been so terrified in my life. Kelly screamed, and that seemed to snap us out of our shock. We bolted for the door, but no matter how hard we pulled, it wouldn't budge. Mark was yelling something. All I knew was that we had to get out of that room. Behind us, the thing started to move, shuffling toward us. I yanked on the door again, and this time it opened, sending us stumbling out into the hallway. We didn't stop running until we reached the stairwell, practically falling down the steps in our rush to get away. When we hit the first floor, Mark finally stopped. "What the hell was that?" he asked. I couldn't answer. None of us could. We stood there in the main hallway. Kelly looked like she was about to cry, and Mark, well, for the first time, he didn't have anything to say. We were all shaken, but we still had to find Jake and Sarah. They were supposed to be in the basement, and we hadn't heard from them since we split up. That thought hit me hard. What if something had happened to them? "We need to get out of here," Kelly said. "We need to find Jake and Sarah and leave, now." Mark nodded. For once, he wasn't arguing or trying to push us to keep going. He just looked scared. We made our way back toward the entrance, hoping we'd see them waiting there. But when we got to the door, it was closed and locked. Mark pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't move. I tried too, but it was like the door was sealed shut. The lock wasn't broken. It just wouldn't budge, like something was holding it from the other side. "This doesn't make any sense. We need to find the others," I said. "Maybe there's another way out through the basement." Kelly looked at me like I was crazy. "You want to go down there? After what we just saw?" "We don't have a choice," I replied. "We can't stay up here, and Jake and Sarah are still down there." Mark was already heading toward the stairs. Reluctantly, Kelly and I followed. The air grew colder as we went down, and that rotten smell was back, stronger than ever. By the time we reached the bottom, the air felt thick, like we were walking through a swamp. It was pitch black down there. Our flashlights barely illuminated the narrow hallway in front of us. We called out for Jake and Sarah, but there was no response. "Maybe they already left," Kelly whispered, though it sounded like she was trying to convince herself more than us. Mark shook his head. "No, they wouldn't leave without us." As we moved deeper into the basement, the feeling of being watched came back, stronger this time. The walls seemed to close in around us, and the floor was uneven, cracked in places where roots had grown through the foundation. Suddenly, Kelly stopped in her tracks. "Wait, do you hear that?" At first, I didn't hear anything. Then, faintly, I picked up on it. A soft tapping sound, like fingernails on glass. It was coming from down the hall, just around the corner. We all stopped, straining to hear it. The tapping grew louder. When we rounded the corner, I almost dropped my flashlight. Jake and Sarah were standing there, facing a large metal door. They were completely still, their backs to us. Something about the way they stood, it wasn't right. They were too stiff, like they were frozen in place. The tapping was coming from the door in front of them. "Jake? Sarah?" Mark called out. They didn't respond. They didn't even move. Mark took a step closer, and that's when I saw it. Their hands were pressed against the door, their fingers slowly tapping against the metal in a slow, rhythmic pattern. "Jake!" I shouted, taking a step forward. As soon as I did, their heads snapped toward us in unison. I froze. Their faces, I don't know how to describe it. They were blank, expressionless, like all the life had been drained out of them. Their eyes were wide open, staring at us without blinking, but it was like they weren't seeing us at all. "Sarah?" Kelly whispered, her voice barely audible. Suddenly, both Jake and Sarah stepped away from the door and started walking toward us, their movements stiff and unnatural. Their faces remained emotionless as they got closer. "Guys," Mark's voice cracked. He took a step back, and so did I. That's when the metal door they had been tapping on slowly creaked open. I glanced behind us, ready to run, but before I could move, Jake lunged at me. His hands were ice cold as they wrapped around my throat, squeezing with a strength I never thought he had. I gasped, trying to pry him off, but his grip only tightened. I saw Sarah grab Kelly, pulling her toward the door. "Help!" Kelly screamed, her voice muffled as Sarah dragged her closer to the open door. Mark was frozen in place, staring at Jake like he couldn't believe what was happening. Then, without warning, Jake let go. I fell to the floor, coughing and gasping for air. When I looked up, Jake and Sarah were gone. The door to the basement was wide open, revealing a dark, yawning void beyond it. Mark rushed to help Kelly, pulling her away from the door just in time. We stumbled back, staring into the darkness beyond the door. "What the hell just happened?" Mark whispered. I don't know," I managed to say. "But we need to get out of here. We didn't waste any more time." Mark grabbed Kelly by the arm, and we started running back through the basement, heading toward the stairs. My throat was still burning from Jake's grip, and my legs felt like they might give out at any moment. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound echoed with something I couldn't see but could feel, something just behind us. We reached the stairs. For a brief second, everything went dark, and in that darkness I heard a whisper, a low, raspy voice right next to my ear.
"Come back."
The lights snapped back on, but I wasn't sure I had even heard the voice. My skin was crawling and my mind was racing, but we couldn't stop. "Go, go!" Mark yelled, pushing us up the stairs. We reached the first floor, but as we burst through the doorway, it was like the asylum itself had changed. The layout was different. Hallways that weren't there before, doors that should have led outside now led to empty rooms. We were trapped in a maze of twisting, decaying corridors. "This wasn't here before," Kelly cried, her voice high with fear. Mark cursed under his breath. "Just keep moving. There's got to be a way out." But every turn we made just led us deeper into the building. The walls seemed to close in on us. It was like the asylum was alive, shifting, keeping us from leaving. We passed by a broken window, boarded up with old wood. For a second I thought about smashing through it, but when I got closer, I realized there was nothing on the other side, just pitch black. "There's no way out," Kelly whispered. "We're trapped." The asylum wasn't letting us go. Suddenly, we heard a loud crash behind us, like something heavy had fallen. We all turned at the same time, and there, standing at the end of the hallway, were Jake and Sarah. Only it wasn't really them, not anymore. Their faces were twisted, their eyes hollow and black like the creature we'd seen in the attic. They stood there, staring at us, unmoving. "Run!" Mark shouted. We sprinted down the hall. Jake and Sarah didn't follow right away, but I knew they would. They were watching us, waiting. We rounded a corner and found ourselves in what looked like a waiting room. Old chairs scattered around and a rusted metal door on the far wall. Mark ran to it. "It's locked," he said. Then I noticed something, a small vent on the wall, barely big enough for a person to squeeze through. It was our only chance. "There!" I pointed at the vent. "We can get out through that." Mark didn't hesitate. He rushed over and started kicking at the vent, trying to pry it loose. Kelly was crying, her back against the wall as the footsteps behind us grew louder. "They're coming," she whispered. With one final kick, Mark managed to tear the vent free. "Go, go!" he urged, pushing Kelly toward the opening. She climbed in first, and then I followed. Mark was last, shoving himself into the tight space just as the footsteps reached the room. I glanced back just for a second and saw them, Jake and Sarah, standing in the doorway. I had no idea where the vent led, but it didn't matter, as long as it took us away from them. Suddenly, the vent dipped down, and before I could stop myself, I was sliding. I tumbled out of the vent and landed hard on the cold, damp ground. We were outside. I took a deep breath. We had made it out. Mark and Kelly climbed out of the vent behind me, both of them gasping for air. For a moment, we just sat there, staring up at the dark silhouette of the asylum. The building loomed over us, silent and still, but I could feel it watching us, like it was alive, and it knew we had escaped. When I looked at Kelly, she was staring off into the distance. I called her name, but she didn't respond, and I realized with a sinking feeling that she wasn't really seeing me. I turned to Mark, but he was the same, frozen, staring straight ahead. It was like something had taken hold of them. "Guys," I said, and then slowly they turned to look at me, their faces twisting into the same unnatural grins I had seen on Jake and Sarah. I scrambled to my feet, backing away. I don't know how long I stood there staring at them, but I knew one thing for sure. We hadn't escaped. We were never going to escape.
Please subscribe for more stories.